What's up, everybody? Renfield here, and we are ready to continue our Mondays in Middle-earth series with the next update into the Silmarillion. So, for those of you who are uninitiated, we started this series back in 2022 with The Hobbit. We did a full read-through of The Hobbit. We did a full read-through of The Fellowship of the Ring, a full read-through of The Two Towers, and The Return of the King. And we are now on to the Silmarillion with this series where every single Monday at around 9 or 10 a.m. Central Time, we do a new episode covering a chapter, a theme, something from within the Lord of the Rings trilogy or the Silmarillion, which we just got to. So last week we read the foreword. This is the second episode of the Silmarillion. So the issue that I have has this section here called the Preface to the Second Edition, and it is Christopher Tolkien, I'm assuming, talking about how towards the end of 1951, when The Lord of the Rings was completed, but it wasn't yet published, it says, but there was difficulties that lay in the way of publication. It says, my father wrote a very long letter to his friend Milton Waldman, who was an editor at Collins Publishing House. It says, the context and occasion of this letter lay in the painful differences that arose over my father's insistence that the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings should be published in conjunction or in connection as one long saga of the Jewels and the Rings. He said that he wrote the letter with a view to justifying and explaining his issues, essentially. But he said it eventually emerged as an exposition of his conception of the earlier ages of his world. And it says, for this reason, I believe it merits inclusion within the covers of the Silmarillion as it has been done in this edition. So I'm not exactly sure which edition I'm reading, because I don't remember this being in the edition that I had as a paperback when I first read this back in the mid 90s. So I may have I bought it at a used bookstore. It was the older one. I think it was a Ted Mathsmith drawing of like the city falling into, Numenor falling into the ocean, and it had like a golden brown solid color to it. I'll put it up at some point. It says the original letter is lost, but Waldman had a typescript made of it. Oh my God. That terminology typescript is antiquated, to say the least. We would say he had a copy made of it. Uh, it was from the copy of the typescript that the letter was printed in part in the Letters of J.r.r. Tolkien, 1981, number 131. Text given here is in Letters, pages 143, 157, with some minor corrections and omission of some of the footnotes. It says there are many errors in the typescript, especially in names, largely collected by my father. It says I have removed a number of errors in the text and index. This is a long letter, by the way. I'm gonna see if we can't get through this in one read, but it's also really long. I don't know what's included in this. I don't know what's talked about in here. So from this point forward, I'm going to be kind of skim reading, and we'll discuss things along the way. And of course, all of those of you who have more information, more context, you want to drop that down in the comments below, feel free. Of course, this is the part of the video where I probably should have said this earlier, but don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update as we continue to read through here. So he starts off the letter addressing Milton, and this him being J.r.r. Tolkien at this point, telling Milton, you asked for a brief sketch of my stuff that is connected with my imaginary world. And I'm assuming based on this letter that was not brief. That doesn't look brief for Sir Tolkien. Said it's difficult to say anything without saying too much. The attempt to say a few words opens the floodgates of excitement, and then he just. I know the feeling. When you start talking about your baby, you're going to ramble and ramble and ramble to the point where not everything you say is coherent. So the egoist and artist wants to tell you how the things have grown, what it's like, how they've grown, etc., what they think that it's all meant to represent. He says, I'm trying to impart some of this to you so that you understand what I am doing and how over time and composition, it says all of these things began with me. Says I don't remember. This is a very interesting part. He says Tolkien says he does not remember a time when he wasn't working on it, meaning the Legendarium, meaning this history of Middle Earth and everything he's been working on for, I think at this point, it had been 50 plus years. It says many children have imaginary languages. I do this. This is what I've been doing ever since I could write. My tastes have changed. My theories have improved. My craft has hopefully improved. Um, and now, these days, there is a nexus of languages behind my stories, mostly only structurally sketched, but still there in part. He talks about the Elves and the two related languages, which is nearly completed, the history being completely written. He says whose forms are deduced scientifically from a common origin. Out of these languages appear the names. He says also, however, I have an equal passion for myth and fairy story, and above all, the heroic legend on the brink of fairy tale and history, of which there's far too little in the world. End of discussion. So this is where he's talking about this. I've heard reference to this where he talks about how, in his mind, his own country was lacking the legends of other lands. He mentions here, if you look at history, there's Greek, Celtic, Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian, Finnish. He says, which of particular greatly affected him, but he says nothing English save the impoverished chapbook stuff outside of the Arthurian world. Hmm. So, myth and fairy tale must, as all art, reflect and contain parts of our moral and religious truths or errors. That's very interesting. But not in the known form from our primary real world, such as. Okay, okay, all right, I understand. So, this is where he's just going into great detail about how he was inspired to create something that it felt English. He talks about here the difference between Britain and England. The Arthurian legends, as an example, he said was associated with the soil of Britain, but not with what it means to be English. So that's what he was feeling inspired to create something that felt like an English legend. Like the Greeks had legends, and the Celts had legends, and the Germanic tribes had legends. He says, in the creation of this, I drew some great tales in fullness, and left many others only sketched in scheme. Cycles linked to a majestic whole, yet leaving scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Now, many people have taken this to mean that he was also creating something that could be interpreted by many people. And this is where we have the argument for rings of power. Because a lot of people will point to stuff like this that he said in his letters and use that as some sort of fact that Tolkien would have never approved of this, that, or the other in the Rings of Power. It just never would have flown. And I just don't know that that's the case. I really don't. I think any author uh, is going to want their books to be read, and the best way to get books in the hands of people is to have as many reference materials to that as possible. And some people are going to argue about the quality. What is quality? Quality is not objective, quality is subjective. Some people love McDonald's hamburgers. Other people view McDonald's hamburgers as the absolute scum of the bottom of the barrel. Who's right? That's a good question. Very good question. It's not objective, it's subjective. So, um, we don't know what Tolkien would have said or done or thought. Some people have tried to use his letters as a way of claiming that he might have thought or wanted to act a certain way. I'm not one of those people. I don't assume to interpret someone else's intent from their written letters. Because viewpoints change, attitudes change. Technology didn't exist in the time that he lived in the way it does today. We can't anticipate how Tolkien would have acted or reacted to certain things because we just don't know. He says, along the way, I made up and wrote lots of things, especially for my own children. He says, The Hobbit was independently conceived. It proved to be a discovery of the completion of the whole. and then merging it into history because what he did is he wrote The Hobbit. It was successful, and then in the process of getting something else published, his publishers were like, we really want more Hobbits," and he was like, "Well, maybe I can fold this into this legendarium that I've been working on for many years," and that's what he essentially did. Was he went back and he started figuring out how to work the story of the Hobbit into that. It was really brilliant. This is the thing where he talks about how he dislikes allegory. He talks about the possessiveness of the sub-creator wishing to be the Lord and God of his private creation. That's powerful stuff. It says, "I have not used magic consistently, and indeed the Elven Queen Galadriel is obliged to remonstrate with the hobbits on their confused use of the word for both the devices and operations of the enemy, for those of the elves." I love that part. He says, "I have not because there is not a word for the latter, since all human stories suffer from the same confusion." Ah, the elves' magic is art, derived or delivered, it says, from its human limitations. It's more effortless, more quick, more complete. And its object is art, not power. It's just art for the sake of being art. Really cool stuff. The cycles begin with a man, I can't pronounce that word. Cosmogonical? Is that how that's pronounced? It says the cycles begin with a cosmogonical myth, the music of the Aonur. God and the Valar are revealed. This is the, God and the angels. This then moves into the history of the elves or the Silmarillion proper after we get past the creation of the universe and how this is an interesting thing. He says knowledge of the creation drama was incomplete in that each individual god. Oh, hang on a second. I'm skim reading this. Partly to redress the evil of the rebel Melkor, the Creator had not revealed all. The making and nature of the children of God were the two chief secrets. All that the gods knew was that they would come at appointed times. This is the whole thing about the not knowing when the children of Iluvatar were going to awaken, if I'm not mistaken, because only that was knowledge was very select who that was given to. The firstborn, the elves, the followers, men. This was the big discussion when the smith god, who I can't remember off the top of my head right now, brought the dwarves into light without the permission of God, in essence, and God cracked down and said, "No, I'm going to kill them." And he said, "No, please don't kill my children." And God relented and said, "Okay, but they have to sleep until the firstborn awaken because they're my babies, and your babies aren't allowed to be more important than my babies." Commercial time, everyone. Huge shout out to the Guild Champions, who are our highest tiered membership here on YouTube. We've got Bubbleonia, Ancient Entity, Crazy's Relative, Remedy. Thanks so much for your support here on the channel. And of course, to all of our members who help keep me full time here on YouTube. Thanks so much for your support, for being here, for checking in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, super chat any live streams or premieres you see, super thanks any video uploads you see. Don't forget YouTube Shorts in that category as well. And hopefully, we'll see you in the next live stream. Don't forget the Discord. Links are down below. Let's get back to the video. He talks here about how the Silmarillion focuses primarily not on men but on elves, although men come in inevitably. It says, after all, the author is a man, and if he has any audience, they will be men, and men must therefore come unto our tales. But he says they remain peripheral, latecomers, and however growingly important, are never the principal actors in the story of the Silmarillion, because that's all about the elves, dwarves, hobbits, and the fae, if you would, the fairy in the fairy tale. Talks about the fall of angels, quite different to that of the Christian myth, it says. So the elves have a fall before their history is allowed to become storial. First fall of man does not appear here because men do not come onto the stage until all of that is long past. Talks about here the making of the gems, the lights of Valinor made visible in the two trees, slain by the enemy out of malice, at which point Valinor was darkened. So he's essentially writing an overly verbose um, synopsis here, in essence. By the way, thinking about how letters used to be written, we didn't have text messages and emails and things of that nature back then. So letters were the primary form of communication, which is a very interesting thing to think about with like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, where people have gone back and, dug up these letters and used them as, you know, access to these people in a way that people don't write like that anymore. It says, as the world grew older, the stories become less mythical and more stories and romances are interwoven. The history of men becomes more blended into things until eventually we have, this gods of the West and the High Elves fleeing westward, coming in contact with the exiled elves in the middle of a war. The talking about the three houses of the fathers of men. Um, he says there are thus two marriages of mortal and elf, both later coalescing in the kindred of Earendil, represented by Elrond the half-elven. This is a very interesting thing because people tried to use the argument that, oh, there have been plenty of times that elves and elfin men have married together, and that's why that we should totally be allowed to share that and show that in a different form in the Rings of Power. Which, here we talk about Tolkien saying this has only happened twice, so it's not that common of a thing. He says here, that story is a very heroic fairy romance. But it also is a fundamental link in the cycle of the Silmarillion, which, even though it was a victory, led to disaster, because the oaths of the sons of Feanor becomes a thing at this point, and the lust for the Silmarillion then brings the kingdom of the elves to ruin. He talks about the story of the children of Húrin, the fall of Gondolin, the tale of Eärendil the Wanderer. Then he talks about the cycle of the Second Age, but the way he mentions it, he says the next cycle deals or would deal with the Second Age. A dark age on Earth. The great battles against the first enemy of the lands were broken in ruin, and the west of Middle-earth became desolate. This is all about the great Atlantis Isle of Numenor. So I'm skim reading at this point, everybody, because this is definitely a he's pitching the idea to the editor. The making of the rings, the rune, the rhythm rune, the poem that we get, Sauron becoming the supreme evil, the ring becoming unbreakable by any craft but his, the Second Age draws on. There's kingdom and evil theocracy, for Sauron is also the god of his slaves. Numenor has its growth and wealth, and then its eventual downfall. In the first stage, being men of peace, their courage is devoted to sea voyages. In the Second Age, the days of pride and glory and grudging of the band, they begin to seek wealth rather than bliss. They begin to forge arms and engines, and then the third phase ends with the ascent to the throne by Tarkalion the Golden, and the capture of Sauron, which eventually leads to the fall of Numenor. The part of this, it says here, the Second Age ends with the last alliance of elves and men and the great siege of Mordor, the loss of Gil-galad and Elendil, Isildur cutting off the ring from Sauron's hand, but the evil already beginning its insidious work, the Wergild of his father, as Isildur claims the ring as his own, refusing to cast it into the fire. It says this ends the Second Age with the coming of the Numenorean realms and the passing of the high kingship of the High Elves. Okay, so this leads directly into Aunul. How am I going to pronounce that? Aunulindale? That's not how. I don't know how to pronounce that word, everybody. Alundanale. I'm gonna have to figure out how to pronounce that before I do the next episode, because the next episode is about this chapter, which is the music of the Aenir. Oh, but that's next week, everybody. That was a skim read of the letter. I'll probably go through and do a deep dive of that before we actually get to the next week's chapter. Make sure I didn't miss anything, but I'm pretty sure that's just, as far as I understand it, pitching it to his editor, explaining things in greater detail, saying, look, this is why all of these things are important. Which, if you're an author trying to get something, there are times when it's good to stand your ground and make your case. And I remember in the very first thing that I ever got published, ever, which was a short story set in the world of Saga of Leucemia, I got back some editor's notes on why they wanted to cut like 3 different things from the short story. and it was removing about 1,500 words worth of text, which in the grand scope of things is not that big of a deal. And I wanted to get published, so I cut those things because they weren't that integral to the plot. The editor was just doing their job, and when you strip your ego out of it, a lot of the times that's what are good editors are there for. Tolkien had a notoriously difficult relationship, not because his editors were bad editors, but because he was a perfectionist, and on top of that, he had all sorts of crazy terminologies and genealogies and names and languages that he had invented that weren't part of the English language, and the way that that's getting typeset into books and everything else. And then he just spent, it feels to me, based on what I know, that he spent the bulk of his adult life chasing down the errors in all these different versions of the books that he had written, nitpicking because they didn't live in the digital age that we live in now, where you can just correct things, snap of the fingers, and have that go global. Food for thought. Anyway, that's the latest episode. If you liked it, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, support if you can, and let me know in the comments below what you have to say about this part of the Silmarillion. Until next time, everybody, stay safe and happy reading.